Hello and welcome to Varn blog. Today I'm Rid Balaji, and we're going to talk about your tenure at the Anarcho-Syndicalist Review and what you think are the main misunderstandings that Marxists have about anarchists and anarchists have about Marxists. Um, One of the things that I was kind of taken aback by reading a lot of this material is that I find that when I read some of the anarchist critiques of Marxism, and I'm trying to be charitable here, that they are actually often. There are some that are insightful. Wayne Price is particularly insightful, but he's almost a Marxist anyway. I find some of Ron Tabor to be sometimes insightful into like particular problems in Marx, but his answers to it are his extensions of it. Go into borderline anti-communism. But in general, when you sent me a couple of articles, and I was looking through these old issues of the Anarcho-Syndicalist Review from when you were there, I guess in the aught teens, the middle aught teens, seemingly. That there's a bunch of mutual misunderstanding, but I also find it interesting too that like if you were to ask me like how do I tell an anarcho-syndicalist from say a council communist or even certain kinds of Maoist, the answer is going to be kind of thin as to the difference. There are differences, but to anyone who's not in the radical milieu, they're going to seem super minor.
Yeah. I would say you're right. Like the differences are not that great. I guess the main difference would be partyism, which is basically support for the formation of a political party, joining it, that type of
Just as
thing.
a side note, though, that's not true for all Marxists. Like council communists are anti-party and even anti-fucking union. So
Right, right. And but yeah, I mean, like in general, I would say the main misunderstanding that Marxists have is that anarchism is a unified ideology, whereas there is quite a bit of diversity. Um, uh, yeah, and like in general, the anarchist critiques of Marx, quote unquote Marxism, are strawmans. Like for example, one issue, as we discussed earlier, was that they don't distinguish between the Sraffian formulations of Marx and non-Sraffian formulations. Um, the other critique that I've seen frequently is that the transformation problem issue. So all of the theoretical critiques are kind of weak sauce. Um,
well, the
you know,
transformation problem issue seems to be straight out of early Austrian school stuff.
yeah,
And I mean, I've talked to you. I feel like there's about four different ways to answer that problem that are logically consistent. I mean, I do think there are valid critiques of Marx. In fact, I even
right,
have some, but that one's always struck me as dumb. It's just
right,
like,
yeah, and like if you there's quite a bit of literature on this already, so it's weird that like people sort of latch onto that.
mm,
Um, the other thing I've seen frequently, excuse me, is when it comes to something like analytical Marxism, they have a unique sort of conceptualization of historical materialism, which is different than sort of like a Hegelian understanding. So they don't distinguish between the analytical Marxist formulation of historical materialism as opposed to the Hegelian understanding of it. So in general, I would say it's a lot of strawman attacks, and yeah, and I mean this is kind of a recent development, but the recent anarchists have started to sort of position themselves as anti-Marx, which was the case like for early anarchists. Like if you read sort of the letters between various people who identified themselves as anarchists and Marx, they're like complimenting Marx. They're like saying, "Wow, this is great. Capital is great." Now all of a sudden you have like these anti-Marxist anarchists who are like, uh, on the one hand, they don't have a good understanding of Marx's value theory, but on the other hand, they're sort of like doing a lot of brand building, a lot of sectarian language. Like one person uh, was saying, like, why should we as anarchists read Marx? And he would say things like that. And I mean, we should read Marx because he has a good critique of capitalism. And
Right. I
yeah,
mean, well, this is my normative critique is always like there are problems with Marx's, there are problems with the whole category of economics, but Marxist economics um, is at least at some level aimed at something beyond what we would consider the nation state, right? Um, whereas, like, the amount of anarchists that pick up stuff like strange forms of Keynesianism or something, which you can't actually not have a nation state and do,
hmm
um, is a little bit shocking to me because it does betray that, like, this is purely a moral response. And I don't mean that in that the moral critique of Marxism may be legitimate. That's not what I'm aiming at. But like, you're positing alternative economic systems that are state dependent and still calling yourself an anarchist. And this has come up multiple times, both with MMT and post Keynesianism in general with anarchists. And yet they will use they, and all this is in quotation marks, all right, because there is no they when we talk about
right,
anarchists. Anarchists are more diverse than Marxists.
yeah,
Marxists are pretty damn diverse
right,
in our ideology. That's another thing I get kind of frustrated with anarchists. I'm like, yeah, the Stalin was a Marxist. Like, I'm not one of those people who pulls the no true Scotsman on that. But so was Paul Maddock. I don't really know, like, what you think you have by just identifying people who pull from a very broad tradition that really splintered after mid in the middle of the Second International, right? Like,
yes,
um, and those critiques often seem some of them actually pick up straight up like Cold War anti-communist talking points.
yeah,
Some of them are fair enough. I mean, you and I have gone back and forth privately, know a whole lot about these different critiques. Let's get into the economic critique, though.
sure.
You mentioned not distinguishing between Schaffrian and non-Schaffrian.
Sraffian, yeah,
Yeah. Um, for those of you who know, Schaffra was an economist, a friend of Wittgenstein, who um, kind of came up with what some Marxists consider a physiocratic hybrid of Marx, for calculating all sorts of stuff that was very popular in the 1950s and incorporated into people like Paul Sweezy and a lot of the 50s, 60s monopoly capital stuff. And a lot of people who also like abandoned labor theory of value used him. Um, but what is, in your mind, what is Schaffrian Marxism? Because Schaffra is, I will say, like people not distinguishing that is often also, interestingly, I don't think a lot of Marxists could tell you the difference if they're not Marxist humanist with the hyphen.
right. So Sraffa was kind of like a British Italian economist,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually didn't know he was friends with Wittgenstein. So that's interesting that you said that. And yeah, and he developed something called the physical quantities framework,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sometimes called the surplus interpretation. And yeah, the intellectual sort of background of that is kind of like a neo-physiocraticism.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the framework was quite popular um, 50s, 60s, even 70s, and it developed a new sort of school of thought within economics. Neo-Ricardian economics is sometimes called, Sraffian economics is sometimes called, but they themselves like to refer to themselves as classical uh, economists. And yeah, like played a huge role. If you read some of like the older history of economic thought books, excuse me,
Mm-hmm.
by Dobb or Meek, they are heavily like sort of influenced by Sraffa. Yeah, the when you get it down to like the technical details, it's you're talking about apples and oranges really. The their concepts of value, price, profit are not comparable at all to Marx's concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, there's a whole sort of list of things that um, I can list like that differentiates them. But basically, they measure value using physical quantities. So like value is 2 tons of irons measured using 2 tons of irons, or 5 grams of corn, something like that, 3 bushels of wheat. Um, but Marx, he generally expresses value, and Marx and the classical economists, they express value using sums of money. So
Yeah.
in capital, it's actually British pound sterling, I think. So all of his value and um, uh, expressions are in sums of money. So it's actually not like the it's quite it's different sort of accounting. Um, yeah.
I mean,
Um,
I mean, we need to go into that a little bit, but you're absolutely correct. That like Marx, one of the biggest things that got me to understand the problem when people were trying to help get me to see the transformation problem was realizing that if I used a single system analysis, there's a bunch of different single systems analysis. People might hear of SSI, TSSI, that's associated with Andrew Kleiman, um, but and econophysics is a kind of single systems analysis too.
yeah.
Um, that you could figure this out. Like, there's no transformation problem if you're
Right.
assuming value is somehow either an aggregate, that's in TSSI, or a statistical uh, value that you get by running statistical analysis. That's econophysics. Um, and you don't have to try to do weird stuff like transfer it back into like physical quantities of individual goods and then pretend that like for like, and this causes all kinds of problems. I mean, I don't know how you figure out the value between goods when you're going back and forth from the goods like that in this physiological way. It seems like an unnecessary step, and it really confuses the math. Whereas if you understand accounting math and assume you have a single system, most of what Marx says makes sense. Um, I'm trying to remember the book that really made this clear. It was in the same series as Andrew Kleiman's Defending Marx's Capital, but it's not that, and it is one that goes through and just explains the accounting math in detail. I'm trying to remember the
Like
book though.
Reclaiming Marx's Capital by Kleiman.
No. It's in the same series as that book though. It's not Reclaiming.
Okay.
Reclaiming gives you the hint to use accounting math, but there's actually a book on understanding capital in the same series as that.
Okay.
That takes that and that insight about accounting and goes through like explaining capital and how to use it
Mm.
pretty consistently. I
Well,
also go ahead.
yeah. I was just gonna say, with the transformation problem, it's important to remember that this issue has been discussed in various ways over the years, and sort of the Sraffian understanding of the quote unquote transformation problem is not the same as sort of like
The
other
Bomba
people's
works
understand. Yeah,
understanding
and
the
yeah,
original way of
and
thinking.
so like it's important. Like there is no like one sort of transformation problem issue. This issue, and I haven't like written a paper about this or anything, but this issue goes back to Borkowitz, as you know,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, like he's you could it's a that sort of formulation is different from sort of the modern like if you read the sort of contemporary Sraffian economists, um, how they talk about the transformation problem, the way they talk about it is not the same as how Borkowitz talks about it. And with the econophysics stuff, like they are using like I know one person, Ian Wright, I think he uses the uh, an extension, like a variant of the Sraffian framework.
Mm.
And problem with that is he's accepting the premise that transformation problem is an issue with Marx, and then he proceeds to provide a solution to it, and it's weird. And like this, I think Samuelson is also like the main sort of person. Paul Samuelson is the main person who sort of um, um, popularized the idea of the transformation problem, and then the Sraffian economists sort of like embraced it, and then they sort of like they're like developed this over the years. So it's a very complex issue if you don't know, like if you aren't familiar with like some of the specialty literature on it, it's easy to get confused about what's going on.
Absolutely. I mean, uh, different economists have different answer to that. Farjun and Mackover
Right.
are not the same as Ian
Those
Wright.
people, yeah, Farjun and Mackover try to provide kind of like a probabilistic
Mm.
uh, solution to it, and that's a whole sort of different approach to it, where they're talking about like random variables, probability, those sort of things. That's a whole different formulation. So that's a great example of how people have talked about this issue in various ways. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and we're not even getting into value form theorists because
Yeah,
they don't, they kind of don't, they kind of don't think these calculations are important.
yeah,
um, I mean, one of the things about uh, uh, Periro, I think that's how you say his first name, Shafra, is he's also super influential on Keynesian economics, on post Keynesian economics. Steve Keen pulls from him. Um, I remember, I think my first encounter with Shaffer was many, many years ago in the repopularization of a book that's now over 20 years old, Debunking Economics. Um,
Steve King.
yeah, Steve Keen, and he uses a lot of Shaffer. I mean,
Yeah,
King has a critique of Marx that is also similarly um, problematic. Uh,
to say the least.
I mean, the main one is like, he said, well, you guys say that machines don't produce value, but machines definitely produce value. See how much more stuff we can make. And I'm like, dude, no one's saying machines don't reduce labor time or socially necessary
Yeah,
labor time, which allows you to extract more value. But what you're extracting value from
yeah.
is work, not.
Again, like here again, this is a great example. Like when they talk about like the whole issue of mechanization
Mm-hmm.
and labor saving technological change, like they are not talking about the same concept of value as Marx. Like,
Now,
and
usually
they,
they mean value as just individual item price too, which is wrong.
yes, yeah, exactly. And yeah, Steve Keen, like he talks about the transformation problem in his book, and then he's also like using the Sraffian framework to represent Marx.
Mm-hmm.
And like I have read Steve Keen a fair bit, and I think he in one of his papers he says like use value. The classical economists rejected use value, which is wrong. I mean,
Yeah, that's just flat out wrong.
yeah, like and like
Like,
there's a lot of like weird stuff he says, and I don't know, like he's been confronted. Like I know a couple of people who've confronted him, but
I
he,
confronted him on air uh, in my second or third issue of my old show way, way back. And if you're a
okay,
subscriber, it's still available. But I think this episode's actually available for free on Mixcloud because I put it there
okay,
probably 8 years ago.
Okay.
So if it's still there, there's a discussion with me and Steve Keen where I kind of ask him to go through his critique of Marx, and he gets to that, and I'm just like, that's not how that works.
No.
Like,
And
yeah, go
yeah.
ahead.
And no, I like I don't know, like and he just kind of like he just wants to do his own sort of like and even his sort of presentation of Keynes is also uh built on, I mean, he does basically what it boils down to is that he's not very like he's more interested in interpretations of these people than sort of like the real people's actual views, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, and like yeah, I mean, there's kind of a united front of anti-Marx economists where you have people like Steve Keen, and then they collaborate with sort of other people. They're basically all ignoring the TSSI is what it boils down to.
Well, yeah, I've talked to you about this. I am um I have a history with Andrew Kleiman personally, which makes me far from objective. I do find his criterion in that book, though, particularly convincing on some things. Um, what bothers me about it is some of his epistemological assumptions. I think are faulty. Like, no, it is you cannot deduce that just because this one method clarifies a problem in a text does not mean it's the only right way to interpret the text if other texts also clarify the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what I think he's right on, though, is like if there's ways to clarify the problem, and when the transformation problem, I think there are actually multiple ways to clarify that problem. Um, then people who insist on that problem are not doing a charitable reading, and I think that's all you can say. I do think, however, with Marxism, there is a further complication, and this is not from Shafra, is that you have to look at what the Soviet and the early Soviet and Maoist economists in China thought you had to do too, because those are interpreted schools that existed and policy was made by.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not Shafrians. So
No.
and I brought that up in discussions about the SSI and TSSI. And for those of you who don't know, SSI means single system interpretation. There are other SSIists who are like mortally opposed to Kleiman. For example, Richard Wolff is an SSIer. I said some economy physicists seem to be SSIers. TSSI is
Temporal single system.
temporal single system, and I did find it explanatory because when you account for time, a lot of stuff that's going on in Marx that seems weird makes sense. All that said, I actually think like that's just dealing with the logical consistencies of his of his critique of Adam Smith and Ricardo and Capital. Like, it doesn't answer all these questions. The Shafran debates are huge ones. There are other debates. I mean, we have the growth degrowth debates. There's all kinds of debates around Marx. I find when I deal with critiques of Marx, the smarter ones tend to be from modern monetary theorists, and they're not based on this at all. They're based on critiquing Marx for assuming too much from the neoclassical and classical, well, not neoclassical, they didn't exist yet, classical economics, particularly Ricardo, and on the nature of money, and not developing out theories of money beyond commodity money and some credit money and capital volume too. Interestingly enough, when Andrew and Kleiman and I still talked, which was a long time ago, when I would ask him about this, he would tell me to go talk to other people. But he also thought that people like Marxist gold bugs, which there are some, are weird. So
Yeah, I mean, with the money stuff, I can't comment too much, but I'll say that this much: the classical economists subscribe to what is known as quantity theory of money,
mm-hmm.
and Marx rejected that. And yeah, that's about like all I know about money. And then with the MMT, I think it's important to distinguish between two things. Um, Quantity theory of money was reformulated over the years. So in I think it was what's his name, Milton Friedman,
Mm-hmm.
that reformulated quantity theory of money.
Yeah, monetarists have a modified version of quantity theory of money.
Yeah, and so what I've noticed over the years is that MMT people, maybe like I haven't, money is not my area, but what I've
Mm-hmm.
noticed in general is that they don't distinguish between Ricardo's quantity theory of money versus the neoclassical one.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important to distinguish between three those things. Yeah, that's all I'll say.
Well, this is, I think this is all kind of important. We're getting into the weeds here, but the weeds here is actually kind of, I think we have to. And for those of you who don't know these debates, um, you should look them up. I'm not going to settle them for you today, but when a lot of anarchists critique, say, Marxist economics, and this was one of the Ron Tabor parts that I thought he was really weak on.
Okay.
He had some strong points about like modes of production being not particularly coherent,
Hmm.
except for capitalism. Fair enough. I actually think there's some truth to that. Um, Asiatic despotism is a here be dragons of categories.
Okay.
Um, but when he talked about like the authoritarianism inherent in like Marxist economic calculations because they were basically just Smithian, I was like, well, you're miscategorizing Smith. Actually, really, Smith fucking hates rentiers, um, and you aren't understanding the point of Marx. You get anarchists like Chomsky who doesn't deal with the economics at all,
Yeah.
um, and his critiques of Marxism. And I will say they tend to be critiques of Marxism. Like they're
Yeah.
not always critiques of Marx.
Yeah, that's the other thing that people should keep in mind is that like when anarchists are critiquing Marxism, they're critiquing sort of like post-Marx developments, and yeah, like a lot of the charges of authoritarianism are actually like more levied towards sort of the Leninism, the Stalinism, those sort of things, not necessarily with Marx. Although there are some people who sort of say Marx was also authoritarian, which I think is
It's
kind
a
of
weird
unfair.
argument.
Yeah,
Uh, I mean, particularly considering like if you like you can go back and forth on who you think is right on the Marx Bakunin debates, but
yeah.
parts of Marx's critique of Bakunin is that like, hey, this small group terrorism thing is not actually democratic at all.
Hmm.
Um, uh,
With Bakunin, he I think he himself was aware that he's not as knowledgeable about like classical political economy as Marx. And the main sort of issue that Marx brought up was not recognizing the state as an element of the superstructure. And because like Bakunin had no sort of understand, Bakunin and Proudhon both didn't have any understanding of historical materialism, the base superstructure, those types of things. So in that sense, I think Marx was quite right. Um,
yeah, someone once asked me. There's been a kind of with analytic Marxist, and I think this is actually a little strange. There's been a kind of re-interest in going back and reading Proudhon, and well, Proudhon has a similar critique of wage slavery. And someone asked me this the other day, and I was like, yeah, but he has a completely different answer to it. Um, Basically, Proudhon thinks we could all just become what Marx would consider petty bourgeoisie. We could small proprietor our way out of the problem. We
yeah,
just and Marx just thinks that will lead to massive people starving. I mean, like, and so there's a whole lot of debates around anarchists and Marxists, particularly around the early Marx's poverty philosophy, his big fight with Bernstein, and then middle period and late Marx, which is the First International, where I think and to be fair to the anarchists, and I'm gonna give anarchists this credit, the Marxists also tend to misrepresent the anarchist positions, so much so that one of the things about Italian Marxism that I find very interesting is that Italian Marxism mostly comes out of the Bakuninist International, not the Second International, which I find fascinating.
Are you talking about like Bordega, those types of
No,
people?
no, 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 no. I'm talking before that. Like you get into
Okay.
the figures between Bordiga and after the First International split.
Okay.
That their lineage comes from the Bakuninist faction. If you go into the history of Italian communism, like, um,
I'm actually not sure. Maybe you can tell us what you know.
well, there's just a bunch of figures whose names have skipped me. I was reading a book on the history of on the Italian socialism and communism, and most of the key figures of the Italian youth socialist movement were mentored by people who came out of the Bakuninist International, because the First International, as it existed and became the Second International after the SPD kind of consolidated, um, really didn't have a lot of representation in Italy, because Bakunin was really attached to the Italian sections of the First International, because he was also a big proponent of the first wave of Italian nationalism, as was Marx, but like Bakunin came into the First International through that path. So the reason why I bring that up is like for a lot of Italian quote anarchist, they kind of became a couple of different things. One of which we don't like to talk about because it's fascist. The National Syndicalist, the Cirque Prodon, which has the anarchist and Marxist in it. There's a lot of stuff there. Um, but then there's the Italian, there's the Italian anarchists, and there are plenty of them too.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also a bunch of people who were part of this Bakuninist International, like the Black International,
Mm-hmm.
um, that became key mentors to key Marxist figures. So there's a real way in which Italian Marxism has a lineage on the other side of the First International split. And that is interesting to me. Like, because it tells you in a lot of ways that even though there's this big, nasty split in the First International, and both sides were very vituperous about it,
Mm-hmm.
that the idea that they were completely a separate movement, even after the instantiation of the Second International and the consolidation of the SPD and the consolidation of the other socialist parties in other nations versus the National Socialist parties. That's wrong. Man, words. You can see how, um, like, this is that hard line between Marxist and anarchist really doesn't entirely exist. Now, the SPD was not known for its love of German anarchism. I'm not going to lie about that. But there's a lot of people who celebrate, for example, the right of the SPD's crushing of anarchists, who also ignore that they use that to crush socialists later, and that's part of what led to the socialist communist split that was never really overcome.
Yeah, I mean, in the First International, my understanding is the main sort of difference of opinion had to do with two things: uh, inheritance, and state atheism, as I
Mm-hmm.
understand. And then beyond that, I don't think there was. I mean, there were like significant differences, but like there's an interesting book on this first socialist schism by Wolfgang Eckhard, which I highly recommend, and that it goes over in detail. But there was some sort of the internal fighting. It was kind of like silly sectarianism in my view. Excuse me.
Yeah,
Where
I think you're right, but well, yeah, because like part of what was at stake was actually like procedural things as much as the
yes,
two things you just mentioned, and like Marx fearing that Bakunin was trying to stack the international with his own
exactly.
people,
Yeah.
and
I mean, at
um,
one point, I think Marx accused Bakunin of being a Russian agent, and I think the Eckhart like shows that's wrong. and yeah, like silly things like that. And then beyond that, I don't think there is like a significant difference. And then like the other thing people will find is that a lot of the anarchists like agreed with Marx's critique of political economy. You know what I mean? Like Marx's critique of capitalism. So um, there's not too big of a difference. So I'm just emphasizing what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think the distinction really comes like really comes after the early part of the 1920s in Russia.
Yeah,
Like if you
that and also
Mhm.
the Spanish Civil War, I would say.
Right. Although the Spanish Civil War, if I'm going to be honest, I don't think a single side on the left actually like because if you were to listen to anarchists, you would think that the anarchists dominated the Republican coalition, which is just not true.
No.
Like it's just like it's
The
not.
other thing that people sort of say is that like the anarchists started fighting the Republicans, which
Mhm.
is only true like maybe like on the peripheries, but vast majority supported and sided with the Republicans. Um,
Well, the yeah, I think one of the things that we have to deal with because the Spanish Civil War is also an inter-Marxist fight because the Trotskyists, even though most Trotskyists do support the Spanish Civil War because Trotsky himself does, and it's hard to argue with that. Some of them tried to stay out of it because they were like, "Well, it's a Republican government is capitalist, therefore we should think it's a third campus position." And Trotsky was there to intervene and say no. So
mhm.
everybody had to shut up. But you have the Trotskyist kind of siding with elements of the anarchist and what was going to happen in the Popular Front.
Yeah.
All of this is sort of eclipsed by the fact they lost. like,
Yeah.
um, and most of our accounts of that loss are from people on one faction or the other. This is not to say that I don't think like there weren't Marxist Leninist shenanigans during the war and a lot of attempts to a kind of subordinate anarchists, particularly after some of those attacks that you mentioned on some periphery anarchists who were not really in line with the broader movement.
Hmm.
And again, this is a problem with anarchists because it's hard to say like who's in line with what movement at any given time.
Yeah.
Um,
And I mean that's yeah, here the discussion gets a little bit complex because if you look at I would say the Soviet Union um didn't really play a good role in the Spanish Civil War because the generals they were sending weren't like competent and they didn't know what was going on. The equipment they were sending weren't wasn't like was very old, out of date. And then once the war turned in favor of the nationalists, there's this famous incident where they seized gold
mm-hmm,
from the bank, the central bank,
mm-hmm.
and then yeah, I mean like with the yeah like
I mean, this is also, I mean, to put this in some context for people from the Marxist perspective, and this isn't to defend Stalin or anything like that, but um, the Spanish Civil War is when it is officially what ends third periodism, and so before that, there's a communists don't collaborate with anyone who won't agree to the 21 Theses, um, which is basically everyone who's not a communist. Um, of the 21 conditions, not theses, which goes all the way back to the 1918 program. Um, and it's what splits the Second International once it kind of dissolves, reforms twice. So there's two more Second Internationals, um, and then the Third International. In 36, the Comintern is kind of dissolved, but well, the Comintern doesn't officially get dissolved until like I think the early 40s, but it's unofficially dissolved. It just doesn't meet anymore after 36. And they declare a shift from third periodism into the Popular Front. But they weren't preparing for this at all. Like they had been preparing for like they had been preparing for this grand like stand down with capital in which they were going to finally get like there are other revolutions that were supposed to happen and the rest were going to happen organically. That was what they were telling themselves, right? Like, so they end third periodism. They start saying, okay, you can collaborate with socialists, you can collaborate with other kinds of radicals, you can collaborate with bourgeois governments even to fight reactionary governments. And that's the beginning of the Popular Front. And you're white. They don't do a very good job of it at all. Like, it's something you can kind of tell they care about, but not really, not like they do later. There's so many like international volunteers there. It's kind of a chaotic mess. There is infighting between multiple factions. And the Phalange kicks their ass. Yeah. I mean, like, and that's where, in history's history there. I think that's one of the things about that, when you talk about the Spanish Civil War, is there's also like the left oppositions plus the left communist plus, I don't think there's that many left communists involved actually, but there's already several splits of different kinds of Marxist socialists. Like now there's a split between the Second and Third International, the Socialist International and Communist International. There's different kinds of Marxists also in these factions, also sniping at each other in this scenario. So it's a huge mess. Kronstadt gets brought up a lot.
Kronstadt, and then the Makhno's army gets brought up a lot.
Yeah, Makhno's army. This is one where.
This is also the other thing where like anarchists tend to sort of like glorify sort of Kronstadt and Makhno, those sort of anarchist movements. And I think like, yeah, there's a difference between sort of learning its history versus like sort of like, I mean, they were at the end, like, it's important to remember, like, they were undermining the Red Army. So it's complex. Like, I'm not saying like what the Red Army did was justified or anything, but you have to make complicated decisions sometimes.
Kronstadt, I'm actually slightly more on the side of the Kronstadters, but but only slightly. Like, I actually get that there were reactionary elements, there were conservative kind of elements in the insurrection there. I think that could have been avoided, just like I think like the abolition of the SRs in 21 probably wasn't totally necessary. There's things that I take, amongst people who are more sympathetic to early Lenin that probably make Leninists uncomfortable. I do see some anarchist points on that. On Makhno, here's the problem I have with that. And this is not a problem of me like picking sides. The historiography of Makhno is so, the way the reports of what happened are so absurdly differently framed that I have no idea what the true events were.
Exactly. Yeah, that's quite right. And I mean, like, sort of one after Makhno, there was, I think, this person named Volin. And he has this interesting book, and there's like no way to confirm what he's saying is correct. And I mean, it's interesting and fun to read about, but corroborating some of the claims is quite difficult.
And the one thing I can say that I studied from one of the things I learned from the, say, Korean anarchist, just to get out of Europe for a moment. And the key figures of the Korean anarchist movement, some of them are revered both in North Korea today and in the South. But a lot of the Korean, and this is something that left communists will even throw against the anarchist, a lot of the Korean anarchist actually sided with right-wing nationalists eventually. But they were fighting a foreign power, but still, like, I mean, in fact, it's an anarchist who comes up with like the racial myth of Korea.
Okay.
There's also these problems with, like, when you read about Kropotkin, I tend to, like, even though I'm a Marxist, I tend to actually really respect Kropotkin, but I read his late stuff, like Like, and I'm like, oh, I get why the Marxists are mad at him. He sounds like a raving nationalist. Like,
Yeah, I mean, Kropotkin, remember, he what was it, the manifesto of the 16, something like that, he endorsed that, right?
right.
And he endorsed the allied victory over um the Germans.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that I think was an excess sort of overstep. And Kropotkin, it's interesting to read about, but I think that was probably a mistake. And I think most anarchists agree, like serious ones agree that that was a mistake.
So,
Yeah,
as
go ahead.
a um,
By the way, Kropotkin is despised by sort of like the early. I've been reading lately Plekhanov, um, sort of the founder of Russian Marxism, and he hated Kropotkin. And the early Bolsheviks also sort of hated Kropotkin because he was very critical of the the sort of Bolshevik uh, leadership, the Bolsheviks in general, Lenin in general. And yeah, like Kropotkin has a kind of like a mixed legacy, I would say, among uh, Marxists.
yeah, well, yes. I mean, but it's one of these things where when I encounter a lot of anarchists pushing these thinkers, they tend to read their best books. Like Kropotkin does write really interesting things on cooperative revolution and group evolution and this and the other. Um, Stuff that's really hopeful and useful for anarchists and puts it in a biological framework that you can defend. I mean, however, there's implicit nationalism and even like slight cultural Darwinism in some of that stuff that's ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and
I'm
I
not
don't.
too familiar with those. Maybe you can talk about that a little bit more.
Well, I mean, it's if you believe that it like group cooperation, but you see your groups as like ethnic groups are the competing groups, right?
Mm-hmm.
So humans are natively, sharing or whatever, but they're doing so within an ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
So group evolution is not like all of humanity; it's like groups.
Right. Right.
So and in this case, nations. There's a weird tendency in anarchism that is not immediately obvious, but has come up a lot of times. And before people come at me, I'm going to talk about the problems with this in Marxism too. So chill out,
Mm.
anarchist. If I still have any of you in my audience, um, there's a tendency to try to find like collective agents in addition to class to hold your position, right? Um, and a lot of those end up being formulated in the 19th and early 20th century in the obvious units of the 19th and early 20th century, which is nations. This shows up in like Bakunin was a big supporter of Italian unification and Italian nationalism. Was that for a lot of things. I believe is that for Polish nationalism as well. I'm not 100% certain on that. I haven't read his biography in about 10 years. Um, the but there's a tendency to go, well, the most natural sorting groups are these ethnic groups. So like it leads to these kind of paradoxes. And there are right-wing-ish people like say Troy Southgate, who I don't think most anarchists would touch with a 20-foot pole that was electrified. But they picked up on this tendency, particularly in Bakunin and to a lesser degree in Kropotkin, to view nations as a natural sorter, and then they kind of take nations and race and combine them together, and they shouldn't be. But you can kind of see where this goes, right? So, and my study of like radicalism in Korea, when I lived in Korea and was working at Korean University, this was one of the things I became obsessed with. And you see all these racial myths that came in from Japan that were partially picked up, like they changed their language to racial language because they picked it up from Germany and they're trying to compete with the Europeans, and this happens during the Meiji Restoration. And then the Korean anarchists try to take that, invent their own racial myths, and run with it. And so this happens a lot.
So are you talking about like left-wing anarchists that became right-wing over time in Korea?
I wouldn't even say they were right wing over time, right? I think that's a misframing.
Okay.
I would say they were nationalists over
Okay.
time. I mean, we associate nationalism with right wingness, but I'm not sure they did. One of the things that one of the things I remember when I was in more like orthodox Trotskyist circles, right, is they would always accuse anarchists as being the real origins of fascism when they weren't accusing liberals of it, right?
Mhm.
Because one of the policies actually picked up by Mussolini to incorporate these people into his state was syndicate and co-op running a bit of businesses, and a corporate here is, all society, a corporate framework, so that the syndicates would represent the workers and workers' firms, and you would do sectional bargaining. And actually, one of the things about the autonomists, interestingly, is like this sectional bargaining stuff was actually maintained after the fascists were overthrown, even by Marxists, and then later on, the workerist, the Apparismo, and the autonomous movements start to say, well, look, this collective bargaining like flushes out a lot of differences and needs in the workers, and we need to figure that out and do workers' inquiry, etc. And interestingly, it's actually the Marxist-Leninists who do that, and it's something that you would think anarchists would have done. But my point is on this is there were elements of syndicalism that were moved to the right, but that tendency towards nationalism is it's not unique to anarchists. Or anarchists, again, don't get mad at me. The Marxists are also given to this, okay? But it's anarchism didn't preclude it, because your nation is not necessarily your state. Their problem is with the state, not necessarily with the national identity.
To add on to what you're saying, you're quite right that if you look at the broader anarchist movement, nationalism there is a kind of a subset of anarchists, right-wing anarchists, that are nationalists but both anti-state. And the example I would give is sort of ANCAPs in the U.S., where they're opposed to the U.S. government, sort of your Boogaloo Boys, militia types people, where they're anarchists, but they're right-wing anarchists. They're sort of nationalists or patriots at the very least. And then, and again, just to emphasize what you're saying, if you want to talk about nationalism is also been an issue within Marxists.
Absolutely.
If you look at sort of things like your National Bolshevism, and I mean even like Marxism, Leninism. Obviously, not everyone is a nationalist, but if you look at Stalin, like he embraced Great Russian chauvinism, right?
Well, okay, you're putting me in a weird position where I'm going to have to defend Stalin a little bit. When I actually looked at the research on this, and there's a researcher whose name had just left my mind, who wrote a book on Stalin and Great Russian chauvinism and Russification, that Stalin is inconsistent on it.
Okay.
Towards the end of World War II, he starts praising the Russian people specifically, but he actually plays groups off of each other. So sometimes he would he'd say stuff against Russia. Mm-hmm. And as much as I tend to be a Khrushchev defender, a very unpopular position on the left, it's like this is almost as unpopular as defending Gorbachev. Yeah. Khrushchev's actually one of the bigger pushers of Russification. Okay. That's not to say you're not right. That's not to say that Stalin never pushed Russian chauvinism. He did. He just wasn't consistent on it.
That's a fair point. Yeah.
But to get to a bigger paradox, you're right about the Marxist-Leninists, right? One of the things they do is to get rid of nationalism. There's a scholar who I've interviewed on my show who talks about this. To get rid of nationalism, the Bolsheviks actually promoted nationalism. Ironically, they would help groups invent written languages. They would help groups consolidate national identity.
Are you talking about Terry Martin?
No, actually, but Terry Martin's actually written on this.
Yeah,
Yilmaz, oh God, what's his name? He's
but yeah, I mean, I'm
no, okay, yeah,
yeah.
it's Yilmaz. It's
Oh,
no, it's Harun Yilmaz,
okay.
um, uh, who is a Turkish scholar on this and the paradoxes of this. But he says it goes back to Lenin. It's not even with Stalin,
Hmm.
just with Stalin. And this leads to this weird tension because they actually, in inventing some of these nations, these nationalisms catch on and become a problem for the Soviet Union.
Hmm.
So, and for certain groups, like particularly Central Asian groups, they're kind of inventing the nationalism whole cloth.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, the reason why they're doing this is they think, okay, we'll build these nations, so these nations are kind of administrative oversights where there's relative democracy, party democracy, right? It's one party, but within the party, etc. Um, and they because they all speak the same language, they can have like rational like planning and stuff in these coordinators, and this is seen as a modernizing product,
Hmm.
which they think will lead to, through cooperation in the international, a
Right.
decline in nationalism.
Hmm.
But that doesn't happen,
Right.
right? The nationalism actually intensifies.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to give sort of the early Bolshevik leadership credit for at least trying.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, the only sort of book I read on this is Terry Martin's book, and yeah, and like there was a considerable effort to pursue equality between the various polities of the Soviet Union, the broader political entity, and yeah, like it was a complex political system that they had, and yeah, I mean, you have to give them credit, I guess.
Yeah, I think one of the problems in the U.S. mind, and maybe even in the Canadian and Western European mind, is the idea that the USSR is Russia, which it never really was. Like it was a much bigger thing than that, and that's not even including all the Warsaw Pact powers who were not even technically part of the USSR. Like, for example, I forget that like Tuva,
Yeah,
you know, was a recognized subnationality with the local government. Like
yeah. There was sort of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, sort of Uzbekistan. Yeah,
Uzbekistan,
I mean, like
Mongolia.
Belarus, sort of the Baltic states,
Mm-hmm.
and yeah, as you're saying, like the Soviets, sorry, the early Bolshevik leadership made a significant effort to curb uh, nationalism, or at least promote other types of
Right.
non-Russian nationalisms in response to Russian nationalism, and yeah.
But they give. I mean, you're right that they basically a in the case of Russia give up, and b don't know what to do with the nationalisms they create because in some cases, in some of these peoples, these were not peoples that really had anything like a national tradition. They had a language kind of
Hmm.
like, and by kind of I mean like it may have been a dialect of another language, but they like figure out how to give it a writing system, usually based off Cyrillic, sometimes based off Latin alphabets, etc. When places that didn't have one, because there was a criterion that had to be met, that Lenin and Stalin kind of hashed out. And I say Lenin and Stalin specifically because Stalin, this is not Stalin as Lenin's successor. This is Stalin as like the guy Lenin put in charge of the national policy,
Hmm.
uh, who debated with like Otto Bauer and his theories of cultural nationalism within a Marxist international, which was also problematic because it led to like competitions between national subgroups um, in the same nation. This was in Austria, um, and so I say like when we talk about this in the context of uh, anarchists or in the context of Marxist, this is actually where like when I read the material, I'm like, well, okay, you're right about the other side, right? Like a lot of times the Marxists critiquing Kropotkin and Bakunin on their nationalism, they're right about that. But also that there are contradictions in the national policy on the Marxist side that I think have never really been fixed and made sense of. Like, it leads to a whole lot of confusion and debates, and particularly when you combine with it like state what is it, State and Revolution by Lenin, where like Lenin's siding with Pannekoek at points and like talking about how we should be getting rid of standing armies and stuff like that. I find that really fascinating for right now. So on one hand, I think one of your first claim, to get back to some of the tensions, like I complain about silly anarchists doing moral retreats, but ultimately becoming liberals and kind of being like really the radical shock troops of the Democratic Party. But I also realize that I'm not critiquing all living anarchists, because there's anarchists who are fans of me who agree with me about that. They're always complaining about their colleagues. So that's not, yes, we can agree that there are plenty of people who call themselves anarchists who are really just liberals who are super annoying.
I was just gonna say, like, I think one thing you talk about is also like distinguishing between actionism and anarchism. And actionism, if you talk about actionism, that is also, you can find that in Marxism as well.
Oh yeah, in fact, actionism is a word that we use to critique other Marxists, which was the action for action's sake Marxism, right? Like honestly, that comes, for people who don't know what that comes out of, that's a critique of elements of the New Left who just wanted to like, some of them were like, we're just gonna bomb places with no one in it to make a point, or we're gonna like, and that critique wasn't aimed at anarchists. It was actually aimed at other Marxists who we didn't like. But there was one of the readings of the New Left now, and I've even had people who are anarchists say this positively, and it confuses me. They're like, oh, it's an anarchistic movement. And I'm like, well, I guess Abby Hoffman and whatnot are kind of anarchist, sort of, but not really. I don't really know what, they don't entirely fit on our spectrum, right? So the actionism claim, that was one made by both the Frankfurt School and by like Marxist-Leninist parties, saying, oh, you're doing stuff, but you're not coordinating it for anything. It's not like it's like propaganda of the deed, which is a separate thing from actionism. And that in the 80s and 90s, that critique started being applied to anarchists who would, particularly black blockers. And the black bloc has an interesting history, and parts of it I'd even defend. It's a tactic that goes pretty far back to the 60s.
With stuff like that, I like, speaking for myself, I'm not too sort of inclined towards those types of things. It's sort of like a recipe to get arrested, in my opinion.
Right.
And then you're sort of like, oh, okay, well, you're arrested.
Well, I kind of get it. Like, the origins of the Black Bloc are like the Black Mask anarchist groups who marched on Ross Street and like in the late 60s. And then it was resurrected to hide identities from police in West Germany in the late 70s. And that was actually used pretty broadly. But in the late 90s, when I first encountered it, and I talk about this a lot because my experience as a young working class zine writer who literally saved his money from a side job to go to Seattle to participate in that as soon as we heard about it and to write about it, ran into black blockers and was like, what the fuck is this?
I get kind of like the appeal of it if you're kind of like a young person, and then you see like these group of people dressed in all black, whatever, taking on the police, but I mean, you're taking on the police, and they have so much more resources, and it's a little bit silly, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's one of these things where. So here's a couple of things I'm gonna say, like in 2013, which was before I was in Egypt, but it happened in Egypt. Some of the people actually adopted black bloc tactics to attack the Muslim Brotherhood, right? And some of the scuffles that emerged after the attempt to reinstitute another constitution. They ended up just pretty much arrested. And they were blanket arrested. Like, they just arrested anybody who looked like they could have been in a black bloc.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, sorry, just to, I just wanted to say, like, it just gives the police an excuse to arrest everyone, right? Like the willingness to use violence. But I will say one thing: in Canada, there was an interesting incident where the police dressed up. The police themselves infiltrated black bloc groups. I don't know if you know about this.
Oh yeah, this is a thing. This is the problem with the black bloc that I've actually pointed out for years. If you can hide your identity, cops can do it too.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah. And then they
do.
started to, as you probably know the story, like they started to throw rocks, and then the police came and shut everything down. And
yeah, the police basically instigated the incident that was used to shut down the. So here's the incidents that we know about. 2003, the Oakland Police Department infiltrated the black bloc. In 2001, in Geneva, or Genoa, not Geneva. The black bloc was infiltrated, and some of the provocateurs were from the police themselves. What you're mentioning is the Quebec incident, which is kind of famous.
Yeah. 2006, I think.
2006. Another problem with the black bloc is that because of those events, now the first thing whenever you see a black bloc happen, I remember this, and some of their formations in like the Floyd insurrection, uprising, whatever. Is that now also other leftists will just call you cops because this has now happened. It's like it's not a useful tactic anymore. My point about bringing this up, but this is a common complaint about anarchists, and I remember this coming up all the fucking time during Occupy.
I mean, that's the sort of image that people have of quote unquote anarchists when they talk about anarchism generally, is sort of like the black bloc type of people.
Yeah, and now like the black bloc is what everybody uses with scary, to use Antifa as like a secret sect that scares everybody.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I mean, again, like anarchism, like there's a divergence of opinion regarding tactics, sort of strategies, those sort of things. And I guess with getting back to sort of Anarcho-Syndicalist review, which I recommend as a venue, and people should read the magazine and so on and so forth. Even there, like there's quite a bit of divergence of opinion on the editorial board, and sort of attitudes towards Marx. And I think that is sort of what people should keep in mind. And the other thing people should keep in mind is that like people are reading different things, their experiences are different, and their knowledge, their levels of knowledge regarding certain things is different. So it's worthwhile sort of engaging in good faith,
Yeah. So I would tell people to definitely read any. I would say Marxists should read anarchist publications and vice versa. I think right now, Marxism is in the popular zeitgeist more than anarchism. Even though I swear to God, every third day I hear some kind of like somebody who's going to probably end up writing for Compact Magazine complain about how the anarchists have screwed up the American Marxist scene, and I'm like, do you guys?
Yeah, go ahead.
No, but this is always crazy to me because they're like, well, the good old American Marx. I'm like, what? the last time that the predominant leftist scene in America was Marxist before 2015 was the 50s. Like anarchists have been the predominant tendency from the end of the new left.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's sort of like the common complaint, right? Like you're undermining the real left. The
Right.
anarchists are undermining the real left,
And
and I
it's
think
just like, who? I mean, that to me is a straw man, and it's like a straw man that you're making up. Like, oh, the new anarchists, and they're neoliberal, and I'm like, what are you on?
mm-hmm,
Like,
mm-hmm.
like
But
they're
again, like there is a kind of like again, like getting back to divergence
mm,
of opinion, like there is a kind of an um as you mentioned, like a pro-democrat anarchist left, which is
oh yeah,
anti-imperialist, and they
there's
basically
that.
don't have a problem with like in the context of Ukraine, they are supporting the proxy war, and they are not like they don't even acknowledge that there's a proxy war happening, and there's a kind of an odd united front between Marxist humanists and anti-imperialist anarchists,
Mm-hmm.
and it's small in numbers, but there's that there. Um,
Yeah, I think that's real. I mean, I think you're right about this is becoming a real tendency for, and this is honestly, this is not even completely new to Ukraine. Like every now and then you have anarchists who,
yeah, no, Syria, Libya. This is, I think, a long-standing tendency, I would say, within socialist movements in general.
right. Um, this is what, like, yeah, because I feel like there's such a concern about not be like with Syria. I actually slightly get where the confusion comes from, given Rojava in particular. Um, but there's been a lot of this. I mean, even in Iraq War, where you just like where anarchists take moral claims made by the government at face value. I mean,
Exactly.
like you and I
And
also don't like a lot of people on the Marxist left who will take other states' claims completely unproblematized, while doubting everything the US does, even if they're right to doubt 99% of what the US is saying. Like,
yeah,
um,
I mean,
but
yeah, that's I think a lot of I think you sort of nailed it there. I think they tend to take other governments' claims at face value. So, for example, I remember like when Buka happened,
mhm,
Buka massacre, they accepted. Well, in that case, they accepted the U.S. government and the Ukrainian government claims of a genocide at face
mhm.
value, and I think that is a lot. A lot of that is what's driving sort of. And in the case of Syria, like they're sort of like um, affected by claims of chemical weapons usage, and obviously, like the Syrian government has used chemical weapons, but I think it boils down to sort of um, media literacy, um, not having a critique of media, how media coverage is used to manipulate public opinion, and this is where we get into sort of Chomsky mass media, those types of things. And I find that a lot of anti-imperialists are they sort of just reject Chomsky's analysis.
Yeah, it's been weird when people like there's just been this tendency lately to like talk about Chomsky as if he was a Stalinist. Now, Chomsky's made mistakes. I think, for example, he made mistakes in the Khmer Rouge. I know I might even have some people who push back on me on that, but I think he did. Um, but like, I tend to think if we're now calling Chomsky a tanky, and that's a term that has
Yeah,
been
tanky, campist, whatever.
right. Tanky has been a term that has even been expanded into liberal spheres, and people don't know. Like, it doesn't just mean Marxist. I mean, I've been called the tanky, which is hilarious. It means someone specifically who supported either tanks rolling into the Hungarian, uh, pushback in the 50s, or tanks rolling into the Prague Spring,
Right.
um, those are the two contexts for it. And yeah, like using it for anyone who might actually be a Marxist is kind of a crazy expansion of the
Yeah, I
word.
mean, the sort of the charges against Chomsky are a little bit silly in my opinion. But I think there's a kind of an irrational hatred of Chomsky, I find. I mean, yeah, again, like there are legitimate criticisms of Chomsky, but I mean, I think a lot of people are not really questioning what our media is presenting, and they're sort of like they're not able to recognize when a claim is politicized, especially like government claims. Like for example, they're able to, like when it comes to the Donbass in Ukraine, they're able to recognize that Russian government claims of a genocide committed by Ukraine is false propaganda, but then they don't see it for Bucha.
Right. Yeah, I think we're gonna have to. Yeah, I think you have to make this call not based on anyone's like professed ideology, because the one thing I will say, they're anti-imperialist Marxists too, like you said, and
Oh yeah,
there are also quote campist anarchists. They exist. They're rarer.
yeah.
But I think we have to make this call kind of on our own. Like you and I have gone back and forth about like, and we're not going to talk about this today, but like how like stances on what imperialism and what groups and what countries have counted historically, and like where the Soviet Union was, and like that divides when people like, oh, anarchists say this or oh, Marxists say that. I've been pretty, I think we've both been pretty clear. Like actually it's pretty varied on both sides of that. In fact, calling someone an anarchist or calling someone a Marxist does not actually tell you the answers to a lot of those questions.
And even I think the term Stalinist is not very useful because, as you mentioned, like we were talking about Trotskyism the other day, there are defensivist Trotskyists who reject the notion that Soviet Union was imperialist. So it gets really complex. And then again, with Marxism, Leninism, you have Hoxhaists, right?
Hoxhaists and actually technically Titoists or Marxist Leninists are a different kind. Yeah. I kind of find all these nomenclature, like I will call someone a Stalinist if they but even that let's like break that down to, for example, what period of Marxist Leninist thought and development under Stalin are you holding up? A lot of people, for example, will pull up positions that Stalin made on economics, particularly in his New Economic Problems for the Soviet Union text. I think it comes out in 1951. But then they'll go to third periodism to critique the DSA, like and call them social fascist. What they don't realize is third periodism also has an economic rationale behind it that is not compatible with the New Economic Problems from 1951. And I bring that up. It's like all the Maoists. Like, okay, there's three basic forms of Maoist thought. Mao Zedong thought, which Mao thought only really applied in the Chinese context. Marxist-Leninist Maoism, which tries to take Mao Zedong thought and expand it to other contexts and draw general rules from it. Marxist-Leninist Maoist third worldist, who take Mao Zedong, because three worlds theory is a belief in a period of Mao Zedong thought. And incorporate that back in, but redefine what three worlds means, because the first world was the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which, that's going to be fun. I say all this because, like, even when we talk about Maoism, okay, and this is not even in getting to Chinese, like the official title for the ideology of the PRC after Deng, which is socialism with Chinese characteristics, which is to separate it from Mao Zedong thought. Like that's just one little branch, right? And then within this, both within the U.S. and the New Left and internationally, like look how many different Maoist parties there are in India.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
there's the Naxalites, there's the Communist Party of India and Marxist Leninists, which
Yeah.
Maoist. I think in English it's like Maoist in parentheses.
Right.
There are like 50 splints of that. Like none of these ideologies, like whether or not you're a fan of Zhou Enlai, Deng Xiaoping, uh, Lin Bao,
Right.
Chen Duxi, any of these people, like uh, Lu Shaoqi,
Right.
these are very different ideological formations, even within the
Mm-hmm.
same broad category. And then you start adding stuff like Althusserian interpretations of this or
Yeah.
Bakunin interpretations of this, and all of a sudden your brain explodes, right?
Yeah.
Um, the one thing I will get, this is something Graeber said that I always laughed at, but I think he was actually sort of right. When you ask anarchists about their divisions, they usually tell you something about what they think is going to replace the state, like syndicalism, anarcho, communism, communes, anarcho, uh, primitivism, nothing, etc. Whereas when you ask Marxist, you tend to get either heads of state or later on after the 50s, uh, philosophers to parse out what you mean, and it's not actually all that clarifying. Like, and particularly now, this is why I always talk about non-sectarianism, just to ask people what they believe, because like right
Yeah.
now someone tells me they're a Marxist Leninist, all right, they might be talking about multipolarism, or they might
Mm-hmm.
be talking about anti-imperialism. They might really not like
And there are Marxist-Leninists who oppose multipolarism.
yeah, there's a bunch actually.
Yeah,
Like,
and I think it was interesting. It's interesting because the Greek Communist Party, I'm not sure if you heard, came out and opposed multipolarism, and they actually consider Russia's invasion to be imperialist. So that
right.
that was a kind of a break with other Marxist-Leninist parties.
But this is a weird, okay, this is a digression that we're gonna have to, like, I'm gonna end after this. But uh multipolarism as a framework is weird to me because it comes into English through two places: translations of Alexander Dugin and Fried Zakaria. Now, it is a category in international relations related to 19th and early 20th century British geopolitical strategy. So
Mm-hmm.
its origins are not in Fried Zakaria or in Alexander Dugin's use of it. Like, it's older than that. Um, but one of the things that's always confused me is Lenin's description of the imperial competition and imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, which should probably be translated as imperialism, the latest stage of capitalism, right? Um, is a multipolar system.
Yeah,
Like, like,
he's clearly identifying different uh, imperialist governments with rival sort of strategic interests, geopolitical interests. And I think we have to here I think the idea of an anti-imperialist revolution comes into play,
mm-hmm,
because the anti-imperialist movement generally tends to think Soviet Union was different, or the Russian Revolution was different because it was an anti-imperialist revolution,
right,
and all of its conduct was in opposition to imperialism.
right. I think, not to get into the whether the USSR is ever imperialist or not debates, because that's one where I actually don't have an easy answer. Like, my response to you about that is always like, well, how are we defining imperialism? Because from some definitions it's not, and from other definitions it is.
Yeah, I think
And
here again, like it gets very complex because there's some people who think about imperialism as a country level phenomena,
right,
and some people who think about imperialism as a world level phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the latter is a post-Marx, and imperialism in general, like it wasn't discussed in the same sense that is discussed nowadays with Marx.
Mm-hmm.
But imperialism as a world level phenomena is something that came out of the monthly review, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Um, yeah, I think. Well, I think that plus there was like a hegemonic, like transatlantic quasi superstate, right? Like
Hmm. Hmm.
that does not exist. Well, still kind of exist in NATO, but now they're. I mean, now to me, when we talk about multipolarity, I'm just always like, well, in a descriptive sense, regional hegemons are emerging, so we are in a multipolar world. I did like
Basic reality.
that's just basic reality. That's like me getting excited about rain. Like, yes, sometimes rain is good. Yes, sometimes rain is bad. It's going to really depend on a lot of other things. Whereas, like, if you talk about it as a good in and of itself, I'm like, why? Like,
Well,
there's no,
they confine imperialism to the West, right?
yeah,
Like,
almost purely.
yeah.
Um,
And so why wouldn't you support quote unquote multipolarism? That makes logical sense in that context. Of course, this is very silly.
right. I mean, I agree with you. It's pretty silly. So I don't know. I mean, like, in the case, for example, of the situation in Russia right now, I am going to, I've been on the uh, we need a peace settlement. I don't know how to do that right now. I actually just I can't really like, but under the terms of both sides politically, they're both winning enough to continue fighting for a long time. Um, on both sides, which could mean this is a very bloody, protracted meat grinder of a war, and I've already read that the casualties in this war have already exceeded Russia's war in Afghanistan. So, like, okay, that's bad, but also like,
You're talking about like the Soviet Union?
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
um,
I didn't know
uh, although I think it's only Russia's casualties in Afghanistan. I don't think it's the whole Soviet Union. I got to check that stat again.
that. Mm.
But but also like the Ukrainian stats are real bad too,
Mm-hmm.
and um, when when I bring this up, I even get responses in my comments where people are like, what Russia's going to win totally, or NATO's going to win totally. Like, my viewers are more likely to think Russia's going to win totally, honestly. But I see the NATO total winning more, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm just like, one, I haven't seen a modern war where that's happened, where like both sides just get to unilaterally slate terms. Like, I literally cannot think of one like since Granada.
Mm-hmm.
And two, the evidence on the ground seems very, very mixed right now, right? I tend to go to like Middle Eastern newspapers for news about this because they have less, dog in the fight. But even there, I'm often confused about what's good information and what's bad. Um,
Yeah. I think with Ukraine, I think it's a complex situation because there is no sort of effort to prioritize a diplomatic resolution, especially
Absolutely.
in the U.S.
There's not much
Biden,
fun in Russia either. So,
no,
like,
and I think there was just a statement today actually that Zelensky doesn't want to negotiate until there's a complete withdrawal of Russian forces,
mhm.
which is very unlikely to happen, I think. And chances are, I don't think it'll continue for this year for sure. I think, and I think some people are saying it'll be like it'll continue for some time. I think the war, um, and I mean, uh, after Zelensky, because Zelensky, you have to remember, like Zelensky had quite a bit of support from Eastern Ukrainians, sort of ethnic Russians, but all those people have been annexed now, de facto annexed by Russia. So
Mhm.
Zelensky's base is gone. So now I think we're going to see Ukrainian society move towards a right wing direction, in my view. And with that, I don't think there'll be like a less effort to prioritize a diplomatic resolution. And again, like with the UK and US, I don't think there is any sort of effort, sort of like a prior effort to prioritize a diplomatic resolution. Russia, I think, if it prioritizes it, then it looks weak, you know. So there's no incentive to prioritize it on their end. So I think we're in a very tough spot.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely correct there. All right. On that note, where can people find your work, Rid?
ResearchGate and academia, and I'm also
Okay.
active on Twitter.
Yep. I will put your Twitter information, and we'll probably have you come back on in the future. So,
Sure.
thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.